I had to learn that hitting back with my fist one individual was not enough. It takes organization. It takes dedication. It takes the willingness to stand by and do what has to be done when it has to be done.
On Monday, February 1st, 1960, four black males walked into a Woolworth's Five and Dime store in Greensboro, North Carolina, and demanded service. This was the infamous sit-ins which sparked the formation of many other protests and organizations throughout America, specifically the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC was an organization created by civil rights veteran Ella Baker, with the aid of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference in April of 1960. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's mission statement called for the use of nonviolence as a tactic to eliminate segregation. They believe that nonviolence nurtures the atmosphere in which reconciliation and justice become actual possibilities. Along with nonviolence, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was very community-oriented. SNCC's grassroots ideology largely helped the effectiveness of the organization to motivate and gather support. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee marked a turning point in the civil rights movement during the 1960s. As a student organization that advocated for the rights of blacks both socially and legally through the use of sit-ins, freedom rides, and black voting rallies. SNCC pushed the limits of society with its moral radicalism and emphasis on the power of students to make a difference.
The 1960s were a time of social turmoil in America. Minorities were fighting for equality, laborers were fighting for better conditions, and draft card burners were fighting for the end of the Vietnam War. Science was experiencing a major breakthrough in the race to space, and the Beatles caused a social uproar. With all the commotion, many new philosophies were introduced, one of which was student activism. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was one of the first major student-led organizations. Ella Baker made it very clear that SNCC was not a youth chapter of the NAACP or a division of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Sit-ins were a common tactic for protesting the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws stated that blacks and whites were to be separate but equal. African Americans were seen as second-class citizens. Their whole life was restricted based on segregationist laws. This did not sit well with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, so they decided to stage sit-ins. A sit-in typically takes place in a restaurant-like establishment, and the protesters wait until they receive service. This was a nonviolent way of protest that gathered the attention of other customers and passers-by, spreading the word of the anti-segregationist movement. Even sit-ins could be risky forms of protest. It was common for members of sit-ins to be spat on or even roughed up.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee not only advocated for civil rights by political means, but through social gatherings as well. In order to bring awareness and media attention to the cause, SNCC participated in freedom rides. During these freedom rides, SNCC members along with CORE members rode interstate buses into the Deep South to protest the severe segregation taking place. CORE, like SNCC, pushed for equality regardless of race, sex, age, disability, sexual orientation, or religion. During the civil rights movement, it was common for different activist groups to collaborate. The area the Freedom Riders traveled through were extremely violent and dangerous. Many other activist groups did not dare to venture into these environments. Before they started out, they called the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. to ask for protection. The Justice Department said, no, they couldn't protect anyone, but if something happened, they would investigate. This meant there was no protection for the Freedom Riders. The first Freedom Rides took place in 1961. A group of 13 riders set off from Washington, D.C. with the goal of reaching New Orleans. During their journey, the Greyhound bus carrying the protesters was set afire. However, this did not diminish their determination. If anything, it made it stronger. At every stop, the organization members were met with menacing whites with eager fists and crowbars. No matter how badly the members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were beaten, they never fought back. Eventually, the conditions became so dangerous the Freedom Ride could not be completed. After recuperating, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee set out again to finish what they had started.
Their willpower can be justified by words spoken by the founder of SNCC, Ella Baker. We want the world to know that we no longer accept the inferior position of second-class citizenship. We are willing to go to jail, be ridiculed, spat upon, and even suffer physical violence to obtain first-class citizenship. The culmination of events that took place during the Freedom Rides led President Kennedy to declare the government's responsibility to ensure the safety of interstate bus passengers. Nevertheless, the Freedom Riders were still met with violent mobs. The Freedom Rides had proved to be more successful in the Upper South than in the Deeper South, but the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee remained unwavering in its fight for equality.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was known for its fieldwork in the South. One of SNCC's most notable accomplishments was its push for the Freedom Ballot in Mississippi, which would help disenfranchised blacks become registered to vote. During the 1960s, Jim Crow laws and the Ku Klux Klan made Mississippi a dangerous state for blacks. In 1963, KKK members bombed an Alabama church, killing 4 young black girls. Lynchings, arson, and arrests were all commonplace towards blacks, especially vocal African Americans. This created a state of fear and was a major contributor to the lack of black voters. Another factor was the Mississippi law, which stated that prospective voters take a complex literary test in order to register. However, the educational system provided for the majority of African Americans was subpar and did not offer the knowledge to pass the literacy test. In order to combat this problem and encourage everyone to vote, the Freedom Ballot was created. The campaign was led with the slogan, "One man, one vote," meaning voter qualification should not depend on race, level of education, or achievements. In November 1963, governor elections were taking place. The candidates were segregationist Democrat Paul Johnson against segregationist Republican Rubel Phillips. In a protest against the unfair candidates, the Freedom Ballot chose 2 candidates to run on its own ticket, even if it was unofficial. The first of which was Aaron Henry, an NAACP leader, and the second activist Reverend Ed King. Based on the one man, one vote ideology, everyone was allowed to participate in this mock election, to show that if given the chance, African Americans would vote. The Freedom Vote called for better education, fair employment, and an end to segregation, as well as the right to vote.
Though this was obviously not the legal ballot, everybody realized that it was a test of whether we can really get people to put their bodies on the line for the right to vote, because they would have to show up in a public place and check a ballot. And nobody really knew what was going to be the turnout for this thing. It was a very precarious place for the movement to be, to face a test like this, which is very different from the militant students or young people doing direct action. Mike Miller, a SNCC member.
The Freedom Summer movement did not go without retaliation. Houses were burned, black stores were raided, and people were killed. One of the most broadcasted acts of rebellion was performed by the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan abducted and murdered 3 civil rights workers. Acts like this were common. This was a very dangerous time to take a stand, and yet the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee did just that. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee continuously pushed the envelope and succeeded in the end. The Freedom Ballots brought forth more than 80,000 voters, 4 times the amount of blacks registered to vote.
By 1968, there was the same percentage of black voters to white. The hostility and unjust treatment surrounding the black voting and the Freedom Ballot eventually led to the creation of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed states from enforcing voting prerequisites. This would protect the rights of blacks to vote. In Martin Luther King Jr.'s autobiography, he said the civil rights movement viewed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 as one of the most monumental laws in the history of American freedom. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's activism was a defining moment in America's history. What started out as just 4 kids demanding service at a diner soon evolved into a massive organization, which contributed greatly to the growth of America's political and social development. Their participation in the civil rights movement was imperative. Without the Freedom Ballot, laws such as the Voting Rights Act may not have been passed for some time. The Voting Rights Act provided a foundation for the prospect of having African Americans elected to executive positions in the government. Through the grassroots ideology, freedom rides, and sit-ins, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was able to garner the support of both blacks and whites. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's Freedom Ballot set the tone for future decisions concerning the rights of American people.
President Jimmy Carter said if you wanted to scare white people in southwest Georgia, Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference wouldn't do it. You only had to say one word, SNCC. It was partially for this reason that Jim Crow laws ceased to exist. Without the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the structure of our society would be completely different. Such liberties as the freedom of speech, the right to assemble, and the right to vote would not be as easily accessed as they are today. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee altered the way Americans perceived each other as well as society.